There are moments in your life that announce themselves with silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something so profound that noise becomes irrelevant. This was one of those moments, suspended in the amber glow of a street lamp at 12 minutes past 1 in the morning. I was sitting in the passenger seat of Julian's midnight blue Toyota Camry, my fingers working the buttons of my wool coat with the methodical precision of a man trying to hold himself together. The fabric was damp from the spring rain that had started during dinner, and I could smell the faint cologne he wore mixed with the leather of the seats, and something else I couldn't name. Something that felt like memory. The headlights cut through the suburban darkness as we drove past identical houses with their porch lights dimmed and their secrets tucked safely behind drawn curtains. I knew this route by heart. Every stop sign, every oak tree that needed trimming, every mailbox painted regulation black. This was the geography of my careful life, mapped out in insurance claims and school pickup schedules and Sunday morning church services, where I sat in the third pew from the back and tried not to think about the man now driving me home. I watched the familiar landmarks slide past the window. The corner house with the ceramic gnome collection. The split level where the Hendersons lived with their golden retriever who barked at every passing car except this one. We had driven this route before, Julian and I, but that was 20 years ago when we were different people with different names for what we were to each other. Then he passed my street. It happened so quietly I almost missed it. Maple Lane appeared in the headlights for just a moment, the green sign reflecting back at us, and then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness behind us. I turned in my seat, confused, watching the familiar left turn disappear in the rearview mirror. "You passed it," I said softly. My voice sounded strange in the enclosed space of the car, like it belonged to someone else. Someone who wasn't a 38-year-old insurance adjuster with a mortgage and 2 children sleeping safely in their beds, and a wife who kept lavender sachets in the linen closet. Someone who wasn't afraid of the thing that had been growing in his chest like a slow-burning fire for longer than he cared to admit. Julian didn't slow down. His hands remained steady on the steering wheel, long fingers that I remembered from college when they used to gesture wildly as he talked about Kerouac and Ginsberg and all the books we read in Professor Morrison's American literature class. Those same hands that had once traced the spine of a book he'd lent me. Fingers lingering just a moment too long on the pages where he'd written notes in the margins. "I'm not ready to say goodnight," he said. His voice was quiet, but there was something unwavering in it that made my breath catch in my throat. Not a question, not a request. A statement of fact, delivered with the same calm certainty he might use to comment on the weather or the time of day. The air between us shifted, became charged with something I had spent years pretending didn't exist. It was the same feeling I'd had the night of Malcolm's funeral, when I'd seen Julian standing by the guest book in that dark green coat, and felt the careful architecture of my adult life crack just slightly at its foundation. The same feeling I'd had in college when we'd sit on the roof of his dormitory, passing a bottle of wine back and forth and talking about everything except the way the space between us seemed to hum with possibility. I stared ahead at the road, my reflection ghost-like in the windshield, and tried to think of what to say. The reasonable thing would be to laugh it off, to make some joke about how we weren't 20 anymore, and I had work in the morning, and Elise would wonder where I was if I didn't come home soon. The reasonable thing would be to ask him to turn around, to drive me back to my street with its tidy houses and its carefully maintained sense of order. But I didn't do the reasonable thing. Instead, I sat there in the passenger seat, feeling the familiar weight of my wedding ring against my finger and the unfamiliar lightness in my chest that came with not fighting against something for the first time in longer than I could remember. The speedometer held steady at 35, just under the limit, as if Julian understood that this moment required a certain deliberate pace, as if rushing would break whatever spell had settled over us. We drove past the elementary school where my daughter Nora would perform in the spring play next month, past the grocery store where I bought the same brand of cereal every Tuesday, past the gas station where I filled my tank and bought lottery tickets I never expected to win. All the landmarks of my real life, the one that would be waiting for me when this drive ended, whenever that might be. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people finally stop pretending, when the weight of unspoken things becomes too heavy to carry alone. I could hear the soft sound of the tires on the wet pavement, the gentle hum of the engine, my own heartbeat in my ears like a drumline, keeping time for whatever was about to happen. Julian took another turn, away from the direction of my house, and I realized we were heading toward the lake. The same lake where we'd gone swimming senior year, where there was a photo of us on a dock that I still kept on my bookshelf at home, hidden behind a picture of my family vacation to Disney World. In that photo, we're both laughing at something one of our friends had said, caught mid-gesture, and if you looked closely enough, you could see something in our eyes that we didn't have words for then. I thought about Elise, asleep in our bed, probably turned away from my side as she usually was, her breathing soft and even. She'd left a plate of dinner covered in foil on the kitchen counter with a note that said simply, "Hope the evening went well." She was a good woman, kind and patient, and everything a reasonable man should want in a wife. We had built a life together that looked perfect from the outside, complete with matching towels and a retirement fund and children who called us mommy and daddy without irony. But sitting there in Julian's car, with the heater blowing warm air across my face and the radio playing something soft and instrumental that I couldn't identify, I felt more like myself than I had in years. Not the self I presented to the world, with his pressed shirts and his measured responses and his ability to discuss property damage assessments over lunch. The self I kept hidden, even from myself most of the time. The one who still thought about poetry and possibility, and the way Julian used to look at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. What do you do when someone finally speaks the thing you've spent years pretending not to feel? When they refuse to let you retreat into the safety of pretending it doesn't exist? When they drive past your street and declare, with quiet certainty, that they're not ready for this moment to end? You sit in the passenger seat and watch the world you've built for yourself recede in the rearview mirror. You feel your chest rise and fall with breath that tastes like possibility. You remember what it feels like to be seen, really seen, by someone who knew you before you became careful. And you let them keep driving. The house I returned to that night, 3 hours later than planned, sat on Maple Lane like every other house on Maple Lane. Beige siding, black shutters, a mailbox painted regulation suburban black with our last name in white reflective letters that caught headlights at just the right angle. The kind of house you could drive past 100 times without really seeing, which was exactly what I'd wanted when we bought it 8 years ago. Northern Illinois bred this sort of deliberate anonymity. Every lawn measured exactly the same distance from sidewalk to front door. Every driveway swept clean. Every family knew your dog's name, but not the things that kept you awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling and counting the reasons why your life was supposed to be enough. I was an insurance claims adjuster. Had been for 12 years. The work suited me in ways that should have been concerning, but never were. I spent my days assessing damage, calculating what things were worth after they'd been broken, determining how much money it would take to make people feel whole again. I drove company cars to flooded basements and hail-damaged roofs and houses where kitchen fires had scorched away the wallpaper someone had chosen with such care. The irony wasn't lost on me, even then. I was a professional at putting dollar amounts on loss, but I'd never learned how to assess the damage in my own life. My days followed a rhythm that had calcified over the years into something resembling contentment. Morning coffee in the blue mug Elise had bought me for Father's Day 3 years ago. Cereal bowls lined up on the kitchen counter like soldiers. Nora's backpack by the front door, always packed the night before because she inherited my need for order. Caleb's action figures scattered across the living room carpet in elaborate battle formations that made no sense to anyone but him. Elise moved through these mornings with the efficient grace of a woman who had learned to find joy in small things. She taught 3rd grade at the elementary school 6 blocks away, the same school where our children would walk the same hallways she'd walked as a girl. Her classroom had alphabet charts on the walls and a reading corner with cushions she'd sewn herself in bright primary colors. She believed in the power of routine, in the comfort of knowing what came next. We had been married 13 years. Long enough for the sharp edges of romance to wear smooth, for conversation to become mainly transactional. Did you pick up milk? Nora needs new sneakers. The Hendersons want to know if we're coming to their barbecue. We moved around each other in our kitchen like dancers who had forgotten the steps, but still knew the general shape of the dance. She was not unkind. That was important to remember later when the lawyers asked about our marriage and whether there had been signs of breakdown. Elise was never unkind. She packed my lunch in a brown paper bag with my name written in her careful teacher's handwriting. She remembered to buy the brand of toothpaste I preferred. She asked about my day when I came home, and listened to my answers with the same attention she gave her students when they raised their hands to share stories about their weekends. But somewhere along the way, we had become roommates. Polite ones, sharing a mortgage and child-rearing duties and a bed where we slept on opposite sides, careful not to accidentally touch in the middle of the night. The children filled the spaces where intimacy used to live. Nora with her serious 9-year-old questions about everything from why the sky was blue to whether dogs dreamed about chasing cats. Caleb with his boundless 6-year-old energy, the way he could turn any household object into a spaceship or a sword or a telephone to call planets that existed only in his imagination. They were good children, easy children, the kind that made other parents at school pickup tell us how lucky we were. I loved them with a fierce, protective love that sometimes surprised me with its intensity. But even that love felt borrowed somehow, like I was playing the role of father rather than simply being one. I went to their school plays and soccer games and parent-teacher conferences. I helped with homework and read bedtime stories and taught Caleb how to ride a bicycle in the driveway, while Nora offered commentary from the front steps. But there were cracks in this carefully constructed life, hairline fractures that only I could see. I volunteered for overtime no one else wanted, driving to claims in distant counties where I could spend the night in anonymous hotel rooms and order room service and watch cable television without having to make conversation. I lingered in my car before going inside each evening, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for 20, listening to the radio and watching the windows of my house glow warm and yellow with the life happening inside them. Late at night, when the rest of the family was asleep, I would sit in the garage with a glass of whiskey and the old wooden radio that had belonged to my father. I told myself I was checking sports scores or listening to talk shows, but really I was just sitting with the silence and the familiar weight of loneliness that I'd learned to carry like a wallet in my back pocket. On my bookshelf in the den, behind the framed photos from our Disney World vacation and Elise's teaching awards, I kept one picture from college. Julian and I on the dock at Lake Mendota, both of us laughing at something Malcolm had said just before the camera clicked. We were 21, tan from a summer of doing nothing but reading and arguing about books, and staying up too late talking about the future like it was something we could shape with our bare hands. I looked at that picture more often than I should have. Sometimes I would take it out when I was alone in the house, hold it up to the light, and try to remember what it felt like to be the person in that photograph. The one who believed in possibility, who wasn't afraid of what other people might think, who hadn't yet learned that the safest way to live was to avoid feeling anything too deeply. The church calendar hung by the kitchen phone, marked with potluck dinners and committee meetings and all the social obligations that came with being a respectable family in a respectable neighborhood. We attended services most Sundays, sitting in the third pew from the back, and I listened to sermons about love and redemption while trying not to think about the things I'd convinced myself were better left unexamined. I told myself I was happy. I practiced saying it in the mirror some mornings. I have a good life. I am a fortunate man. I have everything I need. I almost believed it most days. Until Julian drove past my street and reminded me what it felt like to want something I couldn't name, couldn't quantify, couldn't assess and repair with the tools I'd spent my adult life learning to use. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing a claim for water damage in someone's finished basement. The kind of damage that starts small, a pinhole leak behind a wall, and spreads for months before anyone notices. By the time they called me, half the drywall was black with mold and the hardwood floors had buckled like waves. Malcolm was dead. The words came through my phone in the careful voice of his sister Janet, whom I hadn't spoken to in 15 years, but who still had my number written in Malcolm's address book. Brain aneurysm, she said. No warning. He was grading papers at his kitchen table on a Sunday evening, and by Monday morning he was gone. I set down my pen and stared at the photographs of the ruined basement spread across my desk. Water damage was like that, invisible until it wasn't. One day, everything looked fine, and the next day you realized the foundation had been compromised all along. Malcolm Chun, the friend who had introduced Julian and me freshman year when I was too shy to speak up in Professor Morrison's literature seminars, and Julian was the confident one who quoted Ginsberg from memory and made everyone laugh with his impressions of the teaching assistants. Malcolm, who had taken that photograph of us on the lake dock, who had been there for every late-night conversation and every bottle of wine shared on dormitory rooftops and every moment that mattered during those 4 years when the future felt infinite. The memorial service was scheduled for Saturday in Madison. A small gathering, Janet said. Just close friends and family. She hoped I could make it. I told Elise I was driving up for an old friend's funeral. She asked if I wanted company, the way wives do when they're being supportive, but hoping the answer is no. I told her it would be a quick trip, up and back in one day. She kissed my cheek and reminded me to drive carefully. I left the house before dawn, while Nora and Caleb were still asleep, and drove north through the flat Illinois landscape that gradually gave way to Wisconsin's rolling hills. I hadn't been back to Madison in over a decade, but my hands seemed to remember the way, turning at familiar intersections without conscious thought. The memorial was held in a small chapel near campus, the kind of non-denominational space with plain wooden pews and windows that let in too much light. I arrived early and sat in the back, watching people I half-remembered file in with the careful solemnity of middle-aged mourning. Malcolm's colleagues from the high school where he taught English, his neighbors, his book club members, and then Julian walked in. He stood by the guest book for a moment, signing his name with the same deliberate handwriting I remembered from college papers and birthday cards and notes passed between classes. He wore a dark green coat that brought out the color of his eyes, and when he turned toward the pews, our gazes met across 20 years of silence. Something fractures when you see a person who once knew all your secrets, who shared the version of yourself you thought you'd buried. The careful architecture of the life you've built suddenly feels temporary, like a stage set that could be struck at any moment. He smiled, just slightly, and nodded. I nodded back. We were adults now, respectable people at a funeral, but for a moment I was 21 again, and my heart was beating too fast. The service was brief. Malcolm's sister spoke about his love of teaching, his passion for getting teenagers to care about poetry, his weekend hiking trips, and his terrible attempts at growing tomatoes in his backyard garden. Someone read a passage from Thoreau. Someone else played a recording of Malcolm singing in his church choir, his voice clear and strong and now forever silenced. I thought about time, sitting there in that chapel, how it moves in two directions at once. Forward, toward endings we can't predict. Backward, toward moments we can't reclaim. Malcolm had been 40 years old, the same age Julian was now, 1 year older than me. Afterward, there was a gathering at McSorley's, the bar near campus where we used to spend Thursday nights arguing about Kerouac and Salinger and whether Bob Dylan deserved the Nobel Prize. It looked exactly the same. Dark wood, dim lighting, the kind of place that existed outside of time. I found myself at a small table in the corner, nursing a beer I didn't really want, when Julian appeared with 2 whiskeys. He set one in front of me and sat down without asking if the seat was taken. We talked the way old friends do at funerals, in half-hushed tones about safe topics. His work in historical preservation, restoring old buildings that developers wanted to tear down. My insurance claims, the endless catalog of other people's losses. We mentioned our age, how strange it was to be here without Malcolm, how the campus looked smaller than we remembered. Julian never married, he told me. Came close once, to a woman named Sarah who designed museum exhibits, but it didn't work out. He lived in Milwaukee now, in a converted loft above an antique bookstore. Spent his weekends refinishing furniture and reading novels that would never be assigned in any literature class. I told him about Elise and the children, about our house on Maple Lane and Nora's school plays and Caleb's fascination with dinosaurs. I made it sound like happiness, the way you do when describing your life to someone who knew you before you learned to settle for less. When it was time to leave, Julian offered to drive me back to my motel. But instead of taking the direct route, he turned toward campus, past the dormitories and lecture halls and all the places where our younger selves had walked with such certainty about who we were going to become. We drove with the windows cracked, spring air heavy with the scent of lilacs and possibility. The silence between us was different now, charged with 20 years of things we hadn't said. Julian pulled over by Lake Mendota, where the dock from our old photograph still jutted out into the water. We sat in the car, engine off, listening to the gentle lap of waves against the shore. I still think about that night on the roof, he said quietly. His voice was careful, testing the weight of words we'd agreed never to speak again. We said we'd never talk about that, I replied. My throat felt tight. That night senior year, when we'd climbed onto the roof of his dormitory with a bottle of wine Malcolm had smuggled back from his family's restaurant. When the conversation had turned from books to dreams to confessions that felt too dangerous in the daylight. When Julian had reached for my hand in the darkness and I hadn't pulled away. When we'd kissed, soft and uncertain, and then spent the rest of the night pretending it hadn't happened. Julian smiled, but there was sorrow behind it, the kind that comes from carrying something alone for too long. I know, he said, but he'd said it anyway. And I was sitting beside him, 20 years later, with my wedding ring catching the moonlight and my carefully constructed life waiting for me back in Illinois, and I wasn't driving away. I drove back to Illinois the next morning with Julian's phone number written on a napkin from McSorley's, tucked into my wallet behind my driver's license like a secret I wasn't ready to acknowledge. The highway stretched flat and endless ahead of me, giving me too much time to think about the way he'd looked at me by the lake, the careful space he'd maintained between us even as the words hung in the air like smoke. For 3 days, I tried to resume the rhythm of my ordinary life. Morning coffee, cereal bowls, insurance claims for other people's disasters. I reviewed photographs of a kitchen fire in Rockford, calculating the cost to replace cabinets that had been reduced to charcoal and ash. I wrote reports about wind damage to a strip mall, about a teenager who'd driven through a chain-link fence, about a basement flood that had destroyed a lifetime's worth of family photographs. But something had shifted in me, like a foundation settling in ways that couldn't be seen from the outside, but changed how everything else fit together. I found myself writing emails late at night, after Elise had gone to bed and the house had settled into its familiar silence. Long, careful messages to Julian that I composed in the blue glow of my laptop screen, sitting at the kitchen table while the refrigerator hummed and the clock above the stove marked time in soft electric clicks. I wrote about Malcolm's service, about seeing our old campus, about how strange it was to discover that 20 years could collapse into nothing the moment you heard a voice that once knew all your secrets. I wrote about my work, about the endless catalog of damage and loss that filled my days, about how I'd become an expert at assessing what things were worth after they'd been broken. I wrote about Nora's upcoming school play, about Caleb's latest obsession with Triceratops, about the way spring was finally taking hold in northern Illinois with its predictable progression of tulips and cherry blossoms, and the first warm evenings when neighbors emerged from winter hibernation to tend their identical lawns. I never sent any of them. Instead, I saved them in a folder on my desktop labeled Drafts, and each morning I deleted the previous night's work like evidence of a crime I wasn't ready to commit. But the act of writing them, of imagining Julian reading my words in his Milwaukee loft above the antique bookstore, changed something in me. I began to notice things I trained myself not to see. The way Elise and I moved around each other without really touching. The way our dinner conversations had become purely functional, focused on schedules and obligations and the endless logistics of family life. The way I felt more like myself in those late-night hours, composing messages I'd never send, than I did during the daylight hours of my actual existence. 2 weeks after Malcolm's funeral, I found a reason to drive to Milwaukee for work. A commercial claim at a warehouse near the lake, the kind of straightforward assessment that could have been handled by any adjuster in the region. But I volunteered, told my supervisor I didn't mind the drive, and scheduled the appointment for a Friday afternoon. I called Julian from my car in the warehouse parking lot, after I'd finished photographing water-stained inventory and calculating replacement costs for merchandise that would never be sold. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number from the napkin, though I couldn't have said why. His voice when he answered was the same as I remembered, warm and slightly surprised, as if he'd been expecting someone else. I told him I was in Milwaukee for work, asked if he wanted to meet for coffee, casual, as if we were old friends who did this regularly instead of two men who hadn't spoken in 20 years until 3 weeks ago. He suggested a place called Anodyne in Walker's Point and gave me directions I wrote on the back of a claims form. I arrived first and sat at a small table by the window, watching the afternoon light slant across brick buildings and wondering what I was doing, why I had driven 3 hours to see someone who represented everything I'd spent my adult life trying not to think about. Julian appeared in the doorway wearing jeans and a dark sweater that made his eyes look green, and I felt that same fracturing sensation I'd experienced at Malcolm's service. The sense that the careful boundaries I'd constructed around my life were more porous than I'd believed. We talked for 2 hours. About his work restoring a 19th century theater, about my children's latest adventures, about books we'd been reading and movies we'd seen, and the way Milwaukee had changed since he'd moved there 5 years ago. Safe territory, mostly, but underneath the ordinary conversation was something else, a current of recognition that made even discussing the weather feel charged with meaning. When he walked me back to my car, Julian handed me a book. The Dream of a Common Language by Adrian Rich, the cover worn soft with handling. I thought you might like this, he said, and his fingers brushed mine as I took it from him. That night, I read it alone in the garage with my father's old radio playing softly and a glass of whiskey growing warm on the workbench beside me. Page after page of poems about love and loss and the courage it takes to speak truth in a world that prefers comfortable lies. I came across a passage that made me stop breathing for a moment. There must be those among whom we can sit down and weep and still be counted as warriors. I read it again, then closed the book and pressed it against my chest like something that might save me or destroy me, depending on how brave I was willing to be. The tears that slipped down my face surprised me with their heat, their insistence. I hadn't cried in years, not since my father's funeral, and I couldn't have explained what these tears were for. Malcolm, maybe. The 20 years Julian and I had lost. The life I'd built that suddenly felt too small to contain who I was becoming. 3 weeks later, I drove to Milwaukee again. Another work excuse, another manufactured reason to be somewhere I had no business being. This time Julian suggested a gallery opening in the Third Ward, a photographer whose black and white portraits captured something raw and honest about ordinary people living extraordinary internal lives. We stood before those photographs, drinks in hand, and I thought about the difference between the images people present to the world and the truth that exists behind their eyes. In one photograph, an elderly man in a diner booth looked directly at the camera with such naked longing that it was almost painful to witness. Later, over dinner at a small restaurant with exposed brick walls and candles flickering on every table, Julian told me about the house he was restoring on his own time. A Victorian that had been abandoned for years, its original details buried under decades of misguided renovations. It's about seeing what was always there, he said, stripping away the layers that were added to make it more acceptable to whatever era it passed through. Getting back to the original intention. I met his eyes across the table, and something passed between us that had nothing to do with historic architecture and everything to do with the conversation we weren't quite ready to have. On the drive home, I thought about original intention, about the person I'd been at 21, before I learned that the safest way to live was to want only things that seemed reasonable to want. The next morning, I woke up before dawn and found myself writing another unsent email, this one shorter than the others. Julian, I keep thinking about what you said about original intention, about stripping away the layers that were added to make something more acceptable. I think I've forgotten what my original intention was. I think I've been acceptable for so long that I don't remember what I actually am underneath all the renovations. I stared at the words for a long time before closing the laptop without saving them. But for the first time, I didn't delete them immediately. For the first time, I let them sit in the drafts folder like a promise I might someday be ready to keep. The unraveling began with something as simple as falling asleep in the wrong place. It was a Thursday evening in late April. I had driven home from another manufactured trip to Milwaukee, this one ostensibly to assess hail damage at a shopping center, but really to spend 3 hours walking through Julian's neighborhood while he showed me the progress on the Victorian house he was restoring. We had stood in rooms with stripped wallpaper and exposed beams, and he had talked about original crown molding and period-appropriate fixtures, while I tried not to think about how his voice sounded different when he was passionate about something. When I arrived home, Elise was grading papers at the kitchen table, and the children were already in bed. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled on the living room couch with a claim file I needed to review, telling myself I would finish the paperwork and then go upstairs to the bedroom where my wife was probably reading one of her mystery novels with the bedside lamp casting its familiar yellow glow. But the wine was stronger than I'd expected, or maybe I was more tired than I'd admitted to myself, and I woke up hours later to find Elise standing over me in her bathrobe, holding my phone in her hand like evidence of a crime she'd finally solved. The screen was bright in the darkened room. I could see her face in its glow, and something in her expression told me that the careful architecture of our life together had just shifted in ways that couldn't be repaired with the tools we'd used to build it. She had been looking for my phone charger, she said quietly. Mine had stopped working, and she needed to set her alarm for an early parent-teacher conference. A reasonable explanation, the kind of small domestic favor that married couples perform for each other without thinking. But when she'd picked up my phone from the coffee table, it had opened to my email drafts folder. The folder I'd been adding to for weeks, filled with messages to Julian that grew longer and more honest with each sleepless night I spent composing them. I sat up slowly, still half drunk on wine and the disorienting transition from sleep to crisis. Elise sat down on the edge of the couch, my phone balanced carefully on her knees, and I realized she had been reading for some time. Her face had the pale, exhausted look of someone who had just discovered that the life she thought she knew was built on foundations far less stable than she believed. "Is there something you need to tell me?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. This was Elise at her most controlled, the voice she used when one of her third graders had been caught cheating or when parent conferences revealed problems she'd been hoping she wouldn't have to address. I wanted to lie. The reflex was so strong it surprised me with its intensity. I could have told her Julian was just an old friend, that the emails were nothing more than nostalgia, that she was reading too much into correspondence that meant less than she imagined. I could have blamed the wine, the late hour, the disorienting effect of Malcolm's death, and the way funerals made everyone temporarily sentimental about the past. But sitting there in my living room, surrounded by the furniture we'd chosen together and the photographs that documented our years of careful happiness, I found that I was tired. Tired of assessing damage without ever acknowledging the source of the break. Tired of calculating what things were worth while pretending my own life had no hidden costs. I looked at Elise, this woman who had shared my bed for 13 years and raised my children and packed my lunches with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else in her orderly world. She deserved better than another lie, even if the truth was going to cost us everything we'd built together. I nodded. The single gesture felt enormous, like stepping off a cliff into air that might hold me or might let me fall. "I don't know what it means yet," I said, "but I know it's real." Elise didn't cry. I had expected tears or anger or questions about details I wasn't ready to answer. Instead, she set my phone carefully on the coffee table between us and nodded once, as if I had just confirmed something she'd suspected for longer than either of us wanted to admit. She stood up slowly, pulled her bathrobe tighter around herself, and walked toward the stairs. At the doorway, she paused without turning around. "I think you should stay downstairs tonight," she said. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the years of accumulated understanding in it. All the times I had lingered in my car before coming inside. All the overtime I had volunteered for. The business trips that lasted longer than they needed to. All the ways I had been absent even when I was present, going through the motions of a husband and father while some essential part of me remained carefully hidden. The door to our bedroom closed with a soft click, and I was alone with the ruins of a life that had looked perfect from the outside, but had been slowly cracking apart for longer than I had been willing to see. That night, I drove, not knowing where I was going until muscle memory took over and I found myself on the highway heading north toward Milwaukee. It was past midnight, but I drove with the focused intensity of someone who has finally stopped pretending that staying still is the same thing as being safe. Julian's loft was dark when I arrived, but I stood in the rain on the street below and called his number. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep and confusion. "I'm here," I said. "Downstairs. I'm sorry, I know it's late, but I'm here." The line was quiet for a moment, and then I heard the sound of footsteps on wooden floors. When Julian opened the door, I was standing on his threshold, rain-soaked and breathing hard, still wearing the clothes I'd fallen asleep in on my couch hours earlier. He took one look at my face and stepped aside to let me in. I told him about Elise finding the emails, about the conversation that had lasted less than 5 minutes, but had changed everything. I told him about driving north through the darkness like someone fleeing a natural disaster, not knowing where I was going until I was already there. Julian listened without interrupting, and when I finished talking, He handed me a towel and made coffee, even though it was nearly 2 in the morning. We sat on his couch, surrounded by the books and furniture he had carefully chosen for a life he was living honestly. And for the first time in 20 years, I told someone the complete truth about who I was. And then, without ceremony, without a single word to warn either of us what was coming, I kissed him. It was nothing like the uncertain kiss we had shared on that dormitory roof 20 years ago. This was the kiss of a man who had finally stopped running from himself, who had driven through the rain to claim something he had spent half his life pretending he didn't want. It was both a collapse and a beginning. When we broke apart, Julian rested his forehead against mine, and I could feel his breath against my face, warm and real and immediate. We sat there in his living room as the rain continued to fall against the windows, and I understood that there was no going back to the life I had been living 3 hours ago. The careful structure I had built around my marriage, my children, my place in the ordered world of Maple Lane had been irreversibly altered by the simple act of finally telling the truth. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The conversation with Elise happened on a Saturday morning while the children were at soccer practice. We sat at the kitchen table where we'd shared 13 years of breakfast and homework supervision and quiet negotiations about whose turn it was to handle the school fundraiser or the parent-teacher conferences. The same table where she'd graded thousands of papers and I'd reviewed insurance claims, and we'd both pretended that the careful distance between us was normal for married couples who had been together long enough to know each other's rhythms. But this morning, the space between us felt vast and unbridgeable. I told her about Julian, not the details that would have felt like additional wounds, but the essential truth. That I had loved him 20 years ago in ways I hadn't had words for then. That seeing him again at Malcolm's funeral had awakened something I'd spent my adult life trying to bury. That the emails she'd found were evidence of a conversation I'd been having with myself about who I really was underneath all the layers of respectability I'd wrapped around my life. Elise listened with the same focused attention she gave her students when they were struggling to explain a concept they didn't fully understand themselves. She asked careful questions, the kind designed to help someone reach their own conclusions rather than leading them toward a predetermined answer. Did I love her? Yes, I said, but not in the way she deserved to be loved. Did I want to try to save our marriage? I looked around the kitchen with its cheerful yellow walls and the children's artwork held to the refrigerator with magnets from our family vacations. I thought about the life we'd built together, solid and comfortable and utterly ordinary in all the ways I'd once believed would be enough. I don't know how, I said finally. Elise nodded as if this was the answer she'd been expecting. She told me she had suspected for years that I was holding something back, some essential part of myself that I never quite shared with her. She had attributed it to the general mystery of marriage, the way two people could live together for years and still remain fundamentally unknowable to each other in certain ways. But now, she said, she understood that what she'd interpreted as distance was actually absence. I had been physically present for our entire marriage while emotionally living somewhere else. She asked me to leave for a while. Not permanently, not yet, but long enough for both of us to figure out what came next. The children didn't need to know the details, she said. We could tell them Daddy was staying somewhere else temporarily while Mommy and Daddy worked some things out. I packed a suitcase while Nora and Caleb played in the backyard, their laughter floating through the open windows like a reminder of everything I was about to lose. I included the poetry book Julian had given me, the photograph from college that I'd kept hidden behind the Disney World pictures, and 2 weeks' worth of clothes that would have to sustain me while I figured out how to live as the person I'd always been but had never allowed myself to be. The apartment I found was above a used bookstore in the downtown area, 3 rooms with hardwood floors and windows that looked out over a street where people walked their dogs and carried coffee and lived lives that seemed somehow more authentic than the one I'd been performing for the past 13 years. The owner was a woman in her 70s who took one look at me and seemed to understand that I was someone in the middle of becoming a different person than I'd been when I walked through her door. The silence in that apartment was different from the silence in my house on Maple Lane. It was lonelier, yes, but it was also honest. There was no performance required, no careful navigation of another person's needs and expectations. Just me and the sound of traffic outside, and the gradual recognition that I had never lived alone as an adult. had never had the space to discover who I was when no one else was watching. Julian visited on my third night there. He brought soup from a restaurant near his loft and sat at my small kitchen table while I tried to explain what it felt like to dismantle a life I'd spent 13 years building. "I don't know if I'm brave enough for this," I told him. We were sitting close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, could smell the familiar cologne that had haunted me since that night in his car when he'd driven past my street and changed everything. "You don't have to be brave," he said, "just honest." The distinction felt important, though I couldn't have explained why. Bravery implied some kind of heroic action, a dramatic gesture worthy of the movies. But honesty was quieter, more fundamental. It was about stopping the exhausting work of pretending to be someone I wasn't. I started seeing a therapist, a woman named Dr. Martinez who had an office in a converted Victorian house not unlike the one Julian was restoring. She asked questions I'd never thought to ask myself, about the difference between what I wanted and what I thought I should want, about the cost of living a life designed to meet other people's expectations rather than my own authentic needs. I told my sister first. Catherine, 2 years older, and the only person who had known me before I learned to be careful about everything. She listened over coffee in a restaurant where we'd met when we were teenagers, and when I finished talking, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I always wondered," she said. "You seemed so determined to be normal, even when we were kids. Like you were trying to prove something to yourself." I told my mother on a Sunday afternoon phone call, the same weekly ritual we'd maintained since I'd left home 20 years ago. The conversation that usually covered weather and the children's latest accomplishments and her garden club meetings became something else entirely. There was a long pause after I finished speaking, and I braced myself for disappointment or confusion or the kind of religious objections I'd been dreading. Instead, she said, "I have something to send you." 3 days later, an envelope arrived at my bookstore apartment. Inside was the photograph of Julian and me from college, but not the one from my bookshelf. This was a different picture, one I'd never seen before, taken the same day, but from a different angle. In this one, we're not looking at the camera. We're looking at each other, and the expression on both our faces is unmistakable. Her note was brief. "I always knew. I was just waiting for you to know it too." The months that followed were the hardest and the most necessary of my life. I learned to grocery shop for one person, to wake up without an alarm clock, to sit with my own thoughts without the constant distraction of other people's needs. I learned what it felt like to want something without immediately calculating whether that wanting was acceptable or reasonable or compatible with the life I thought I was supposed to live. Julian and I moved slowly, carefully, like people handling something fragile that had already been broken once. We had dinner twice a week, went to galleries and bookstores and the farmer's market where he bought vegetables for elaborate meals he cooked in his loft while I watched, and tried to remember the last time I'd been in a kitchen where cooking was about pleasure rather than obligation. We didn't rush toward anything that looked like a traditional relationship. We were both too aware of how much damage could be done by moving faster than readiness allowed. But we were learning each other again, discovering how 20 years had changed us, and what had remained constant underneath all the careful adaptations we'd made to survive in a world that hadn't seemed to have space for who we really were. And slowly, carefully, I began to understand that choosing honesty over safety wasn't the same thing as choosing destruction over stability. It was choosing life over the careful performance of living. A year later, I sat in the auditorium of Nora's elementary school, watching my daughter transform into a woodland fairy for the spring production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. She wore gossamer wings that caught the stage lights and spoke her lines with the serious concentration of a 9-year-old who had memorized every word perfectly and intended to deliver them exactly as rehearsed. Elise sat beside me, close enough that our elbows occasionally touched on the armrest between our seats. We had found our way to a different kind of peace, she and I. Not the comfortable distance of our marriage, but something more honest and therefore more generous. We were better as friends, we discovered. Better as co-parents who could sit together at school plays and birthday parties and soccer games without the weight of all the things we'd never said to each other. The divorce had been as quiet as our marriage had been. No lawyers screaming across conference tables, no battles over custody or property division. Just two people who had loved each other in the ways they knew how. acknowledging that love sometimes meant letting each other go toward the lives they were meant to live. The children had adjusted with the resilience that children possess when the adults in their lives handle crisis with grace instead of drama. They spent weekends with me in the bookstore apartment, where we made pancakes on Saturday mornings and read together in the window seat that overlooked the street. Caleb had claimed the small back room as his fort, where his dinosaur collection could spread across the floor without anyone asking him to clean it up. Nora had discovered the poetry section in the bookstore downstairs and spent hours reading verses she didn't fully understand but loved for their music. When the play ended, we applauded with the rest of the audience, and Nora took her bow with the bright smile of someone who had done exactly what she'd set out to do. Later, outside in the school parking lot, she ran to hug both of us, still wearing her fairy wings and glowing with the satisfaction of a performance well delivered. Julian waited by his car at the edge of the parking lot, patient as always, understanding that these moments belonged to the family I'd built before I'd found the courage to build the life I actually wanted. Nora saw him and waved, then ran over to show him how her wings moved when she spun in circles. Elise watched this interaction with the careful attention she brought to everything involving the children, but her expression was calm, even warm. She had met Julian officially 3 months earlier, over coffee at a neutral location where they could assess each other as adults who shared the complicated responsibility of caring about the same person. They had found, to everyone's surprise, that they actually liked each other. "He's good for you," she had told me afterward. "You laugh more now." I hadn't realized, until she said it, that laughter had been one of the casualties of the life I'd been living before. That somewhere along the way I'd forgotten how to find joy in small moments, how to be present for my own experience instead of always calculating how it might appear to someone else. The drive back to Julian's place took us past the street where I used to live, past the house on Maple Lane with its careful lawn and regulation black mailbox. I glanced at it as we passed, the way you might look at a photograph of yourself from years ago, recognizing the person in the image but feeling no urge to return to that version of yourself. Julian's loft had become home in ways that surprised me with their completeness. Not because I'd moved in officially, but because it was the first place I'd ever lived where I didn't have to perform a version of myself that felt borrowed from someone else's idea of who I should be. The books on the shelves were books I'd chosen. The music that played while we cooked dinner was music we both loved. The conversations that filled the rooms were conversations between two people who had decided to stop hiding from themselves and each other. That night, we sat on the floor of his living room, our knees touching, listening to a vinyl record that crackled quietly through the speakers he'd restored from some estate sale. Miles Davis, something slow and contemplative that matched the soft rain beginning to fall against the windows. Julian reached over and adjusted the scarf I was wearing, the one he'd left on my doorknob during those first tentative months when we were learning how to be honest with each other. It had become mine in the way that objects do when they carry more meaning than their practical function would suggest. We didn't talk much that evening. After a year of conversations that had excavated 20 years of silence, we had learned to value the quiet moments as much as the revelations. I leaned against his shoulder and listened to the rain, and the music and the sound of our breathing synchronized in the way that happens when two people have stopped fighting against their own contentment. There were no fireworks, no dramatic declarations of love that would have made this moment feel borrowed from someone else's story. Just two men in their 40s who had found each other again after spending decades pretending they were meant to be other people, sitting in a room that smelled like old books and coffee and the particular kind of peace that comes from finally telling the truth about who you are. I thought about damage assessment, the work that had filled my days for so many years. How I'd learned to calculate the cost of repairing things that had been broken, to determine what could be salvaged and what needed to be replaced entirely. But sitting there in Julian's living room, I understood that some kinds of damage weren't meant to be repaired. Sometimes breaking was the only way to discover what you were actually made of underneath all the careful construction. The record ended, but neither of us moved to change it. Outside, the rain continued its soft percussion against the glass, and somewhere in the building below us, the bookstore settled into its nighttime quiet. On the windowsill beside us sat Julian's reading glasses, abandoned there earlier in the evening, catching the reflection of the streetlights and the rain. I was breathing freely for the first time in longer than I could remember. Not the careful, measured breathing of someone monitoring his own performance, but the unconscious rhythm of someone who had finally stopped holding his breath. Later, when people asked me about that year, about how I'd found the courage to change everything about my life when I was nearly 40 years old, I would tell them it hadn't been about courage at all. It had been about finally admitting that the life I'd been living was too small to contain who I actually was. And that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply stop pretending that pretending is the same thing as living. The sound of laughter, low and real and completely unguarded, filled the room. Mine, his, ours. For the first time in my adult life, I was saying goodnight on my own terms.